Have you ever wondered why some ideas challenge us so deeply that they disturb us to our core? What is harder, to accept uncomfortable truths or to keep living in an illusion? What if someone told you that everything you believe in might simply be a comforting lie? Imagine someone who looks at the world and says, all of this is weak, illusory, and falling apart. That person was Nietzsche. But why does he bother us so much? Is it because he forces us to leave our comfort zone? Or maybe we reject him because deep down, he makes us feel vulnerable, without a solid ground beneath our feet? Do you think Nietzsche was wrong? Or did he know something no one else dared to admit? A curious fact about great thinkers is that often they fear being fully understood even more than being misunderstood. Friedrich Nietzsche is a clear example of this. Among all the philosophers in history, he might be one of the most provocative, a true generator of debates. His ideas have left a profound mark on fields ranging from art to ethics, influencing even existentialism. Yet there are also many who despise what he represents. Every time I talk about Nietzsche, just one video sparks a flood of passionate comments. Many admire him, many others reject him, and often those reactions say more about the commenters themselves than about the philosopher. With this in mind, today I decided to address some of the most common criticisms surrounding him. We'll explore why he has become such a powerful source of controversy and, at the same time, try to discern whether those criticisms are justified or if they arise from misunderstandings and caricatures. And let me warn you now, what you'll hear here is my personal interpretation of Nietzsche. I don't claim to give the final word on what he really meant, because if there is one thing Nietzsche did not want, it was to be reduced to simple conclusions. My plan is to break down these criticisms in stages. First, I'll present Nietzsche's ideas that spark controversy. Then we'll dive into the criticisms themselves. Finally, we'll discuss whether those criticisms are based on facts or distortions of his original ideas. So without further delay, let's start with the core of many disputes: Nietzsche's particular view on morality. If there's something you probably heard about Nietzsche, it's how he challenged traditional morality. One of his most famous, and not by chance one of the most debated, concepts is the idea of the morality of resentment. In books like Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche makes it clear that he is not interested in determining which ethical system is correct or true. For him, absolute truth in moral matters simply does not exist. Instead, what he wants is to understand why we adopt certain values. What caused our moral beliefs to develop the way they have today? Nietzsche was not afraid to address delicate topics. He believed that Christian morality, and by extension, many egalitarian ideas derived from it, was based on a powerful psychological mechanism: resentment. And this is where the discomfort begins. Does this mean that Nietzsche was a tyrant, as many accuse him of being? Or perhaps he was simply misunderstood, turned into something he never wanted to be? This is just the beginning of our journey through this fascinating figure. We will untangle the knots that tie Nietzsche to controversy and discover together what lies behind all the fuss surrounding his name. By training, Friedrich Nietzsche was a philologist, that is, an expert in classical languages and cultures. When studying ancient texts, he noticed something surprising. Those civilizations valued qualities like physical strength, power, and skill, attributes that, in modern times influenced by Christianity, had lost their prestige. This observation was the starting point for many of the provocative ideas Nietzsche developed throughout his work. In ancient societies, heroes and notable figures were not ashamed of their ambition or pride. On the contrary, those traits were admired and celebrated. For those thinkers, humility and piety were not primary virtues. For example, someone like Achilles would never say, "I am a sinner seeking constant redemption." Instead, he might say something like, "I choose glory because I possess the power and skill to achieve it." Nietzsche argued that the arrival of Christianity radically transformed the European moral landscape. For him, this new morality was not born from strength, but from weakness and resentment, a central theme in his work on the genealogy of morality. According to Nietzsche, in a stage he called pre-moral, the strongest naturally assumed leadership. It was not a sophisticated idea of self-control or mastery, but a direct and objective force capable of shaping their environment. However, Nietzsche acknowledged that even those strong individuals had to overcome internal struggles to exercise their power. For him, true strength was not only about dominating others, but also about conquering oneself. On the other hand, those with less power, the weaker ones, often felt frustration, both because they could not impose their will and because they were subject to the strong. This resentment, according to Nietzsche, gave rise to a new morality, the morality of the slave. In this system, values like kindness, weakness, nonviolence, and pity began to be elevated. But Nietzsche saw this as a deliberate strategy, a form of philosophical revenge by the weak against the strong. This new moral order for Nietzsche pursued two main goals: to reduce the influence and power of the strongest, creating an environment where the powerful were driven to show compassion toward the weak, thus lowering the chances of retaliation; to limit the development and growth of the most powerful individuals, those who grow up believing that seeking power is inherently bad and that being harmless is a virtue will hardly ever unfold their true strength. For Nietzsche, this radical shift in values represented one of the most momentous events in human history. It not only questioned the foundations of Christian morality, but also challenged us to reflect on the origin and intentions behind the values we take for granted. His invitation is straightforward: to understand, and perhaps overcome, the limitations imposed by this morality typical of slaves, seeking a life that celebrates creativity, power, and self-overcoming. In his bold critique, Nietzsche described a phenomenon he called the transvaluation of values. For him, the ethical norms of modern society, especially those influenced by Christianity, arose from deep resentment. Their only way to get revenge on their enemies and oppressors was through a radical transvaluation of values, which at the same time constituted an act of the most cunning revenge. Nietzsche wrote, with this he implied that the dominant morality we so respect today has roots in something far less noble than we might want to admit. This slave morality, as he called it, turned virtues like strength, ambition, and independence into sins, while elevating sacrifice, submission, and forgiveness to the status of supreme virtues. For Nietzsche, this inversion of values did not represent progress, but rather a decline of human greatness. In his view, by focusing on the weakest, humanity forgot its potential to create and transform. Instead of aspiring to greatness, it became trapped in a morality that seeks to level everyone to the same plane. He believed it was time to leave this framework behind and generate new values that exalt strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. Values to be forged by those he called the Übermensch, or overmen. But what was Nietzsche really proposing? Did he want to return to the old morality of the nobles, or to create something completely different? This question remains without a definitive answer, as his work allows for various interpretations. While some passages suggest he saw these new values as a personal and individual experience, others hint that they might eventually transform society as a whole. Of course, not everyone agreed with Nietzsche. Leo Tolstoy, for example, considered his proposal a threat to the ethical pillars that sustain human coexistence. For Tolstoy, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself was not just a virtue but the indispensable foundation of any just society. Abandoning these principles, he thought, would lead us to chaos without a solid moral framework. Dostoevsky, for his part, also questioned what would remain of humanity if these values were lost. Despite its flaws, Christian morality was still, for him, an ethical compass that offered hope and unity. Moreover, there are criticisms toward the figures Nietzsche admired. For instance, he praised Napoleon as a man capable of changing Europe's destiny, but also lauded Napoleon's way of considering others as inferior. Today, these ideas clash with contemporary values that prioritize equality and dignity for all. Reflecting on Nietzsche inevitably leads us to question our own principles. Are we trapped by a morality that limits our abilities? Or is this morality, with all its flaws, the only possible path toward a fairer society? Perhaps true wisdom lies in finding a middle ground, recognizing the importance of compassion and equality without giving up the drive to surpass ourselves and create something exceptional. Nietzsche is often criticized for supposedly not giving enough importance to caring for others, which some see as a weakness in his philosophy, especially from a psychological standpoint. Psychologists like Martin Seligman, for example, argue that genuine care for others is fundamental to a fulfilling life. However, Nietzsche does not completely reject this idea. In Beyond Good and Evil, he devotes much reflection to relationships among noble men, analyzing how exceptional individuals can, at times, show generosity toward the more vulnerable. Still, his critique of the so-called slave morality, which places universal care at the center of virtue, and his strong statements about contempt for the weak give his philosophy a tone many perceive as overly selfish. For most people, accepting this idea is difficult and provokes resistance. Yet this is a point worth revisiting, and we will likely return to it later. But the question lingering is, might this criticism of Nietzsche partly stem from a misunderstanding of what he really proposes? A key aspect is that Nietzsche never intended for his ideas to be accepted by everyone. He saw his philosophy as aimed at a few, those capable of breaking free from centuries of conditioning based on traditional morality. For him, humanity is so immersed in this slave morality that it instinctively reacts against any attempt to question it. Still, it is possible to interpret Nietzsche in a less rigid way, finding in his texts a genuine love for humanity. For example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the titular prophet expresses a deep desire for humanity to reach its highest potential. From this perspective, Nietzsche's apparent harshness toward weakness can be understood not as tyranny, but as the attitude of a demanding father who challenges his children not to settle, not to waste their existence. That said, it's also easy to go to the opposite extreme, softening Nietzsche's ideas so much that they lose the strength and discomfort he clearly intended to provoke. There is a tendency, especially in popular discourse, to turn his provocations into something banal and harmless, as if he were simply saying, "Be authentic, follow your heart." If that were the case, Nietzsche would hardly have become one of history's most influential and controversial thinkers. In the end, this tension is what makes Nietzsche so challenging. He forces us to face uncomfortable ideas and step out of our comfort zone. Maybe that's why many find it hard to relate to him. Nietzsche is the kind of philosopher who divides people into two clear groups: those who completely reject his view that morality arises from resentment, and those who frown at the alternatives he proposes. But this time, I won't stop to delve into morality and its dark side. I want to focus on another controversial area that fascinated Nietzsche: religion. And look, Nietzsche didn't just provoke, he managed to infuriate much of the world by directly challenging the idea of religious faith. Even if you've never read one of his books and only clicked here because of the eye-catching thumbnail, you probably know one of his most famous quotes: "God is dead, and we have killed him." Over time, this statement became a rallying cry for certain atheists, especially during the 2000s, while others see it as a melancholic and pessimistic lament for a world that has lost its moral and spiritual foundation. However, Nietzsche's relationship with religion is much deeper and more complex than these superficial readings usually show. Essentially, he did not consider religious faith especially brilliant, but neither the greatest stupidity humanity ever created. His critique goes beyond religion as we commonly understand it. For Nietzsche, religion is not just belief in one god or many gods. Rather, it is the passive, unquestioning acceptance of an inherited value system without reflecting or actively engaging in creating the principles that guide your existence. When Nietzsche says, "God is dead," God remains dead, and we have killed him, he is pointing to the decline of traditional religion in Europe and the possible consequences of this phenomenon for society. It is precisely here that many misunderstand his ideas. Some interpret this phrase as a celebration, a toast to freedom, as if the disappearance of religion opens the way to a future ruled by science, reason, or humanity itself. Others, however, perceive it as a deep lament, almost an apocalyptic warning about an irreversible path toward chaos. And interestingly, both interpretations hold some truth. Nietzsche at times describes religion as an intellectually oppressive force that limits human thought, but at the same time, he admits that the death of God is not a glorious victory. The phrase that immediately follows "God is dead" is revealing. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of murderers? Here Nietzsche does not present the situation as a liberating revolution, but as an act of deicide, a crime against something that, although imperfect, gave humanity a sense of direction and purpose. That ambivalence is what makes Nietzsche's thought so captivating. He is not only pointing out problems, but throwing us directly into a dilemma. Without God, without religion, without those inherited values, what comes next? Are we truly ready to bear the burden of building something new in their place? There is a way to interpret Nietzsche's ideas that manages to reconcile opposing positions and offer a more balanced view. A recurring theme in his work, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra to his posthumous writings, is the impact of religion's decline. Nietzsche saw this change as a crossroads. On one hand, there was the danger of falling into nihilism, hedonism, or some form of new idolatry. On the other, there was the possibility that we might become the creators of our own values. The path taken would depend on the strength of each individual's will. For Nietzsche, some people could not develop a strong will without having an established belief system to guide their lives. These people ended up collapsing. However, he also envisioned another alternative: individuals with a solid will who could embrace the void left by the death of God, and from there, build something new. These would be the active nihilists, those who accept chaos and with courage create meaning in that void, like children shaping castles in the sand of an existential desert. This creative spirit is what Nietzsche associates with the concept of the Übermensch, the overman or superman, introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche's critiques, especially of Christianity, are well known for their sharp tone. He often portrayed religious people as weak, as if they were avoiding the responsibility of creating their own values. Much of his rejection of Christianity stemmed from his view that this religion promoted an egalitarian morality, which he believed limited human potential. However, not all religions were judged the same way. Some forms of Hinduism, for example, earned greater respect because, according to Nietzsche, they accepted natural hierarchies and encouraged a kind of healthy elitism. Still, in the end, Nietzsche regarded any religious belief as a form of intellectual cowardice, a refusal to face life without metaphysical crutches. It's understandable that this stance caused great controversy, especially among religious thinkers. For those who believe in a personal, loving, and all-powerful God who sets objective values for universal well-being, the idea that such faith is a sign of weakness sounds absurd. Christians like St. Augustine or C.S. Lewis, for example, argued the opposite. Denying God would actually be an act of cowardice, a flight from what such commitment and personal transformation require. Nevertheless, it may be unfair to define Nietzsche simply as someone who hated religion. He was not a provocative atheist who saw religion only as an obstacle to civilization. His critique ran deeper. Nietzsche rejected any system that did not allow fundamental questioning or that encouraged people to place their devotion in something external, thereby diverting them from the responsibility to strengthen their own will. Interestingly, this criticism was not limited to religion. In unpublished writings, he directed similar observations at those who saw science as the ultimate answer to questions of values, showing that his distrust extended to any form of dogmatism, religious or secular. Nietzsche also had no mercy for those who constructed rigid philosophical systems. For him, this effort was as mistaken as religion because both sought an external authority to dictate how we should live. This reliance on external factors, whether religious dogmas or rigid philosophies, represented for Nietzsche a way of escaping the most difficult and essential task of existence, creating our own values. For that very reason, Nietzsche firmly rejected the overvaluation of racial or national identities. To him, glorifying a race or a nation was nothing more than an excuse to avoid the task of creating one's own values. He saw it as a reflection of a narrow mindset, often fueled by internal resentments or personal insecurities. When a person clings to fixed aspects of their identity, such as ethnicity or origin, Nietzsche interpreted this as an attempt to find a shortcut, a way to gain meaning without effort. For him, this was contemptible. He also linked racism, particularly anti-Semitism, to a kind of resentful envy. In his view, these attitudes were petty responses to the perception that others possess something the envious person lacks. For Nietzsche, such behavior was a clear sign of weakness, a way of avoiding the real responsibility to create and uphold one's own values. His critique of religion wasn't just an isolated rejection. It was part of a broader perspective on the human tendency to adopt belief systems out of comfort or intellectual laziness. To him, this was a way of avoiding a genuine and personal confrontation with the question of values. Nevertheless, Nietzsche acknowledged that religion, with all its flaws, was still preferable to total nihilism, that complete void that consumes us when we fail to forge our own values or maintain any meaningful belief. However, an intriguing question arises from his ideas. What happens to those who cannot generate their own values? Would the values created by the strongest and most creative individuals be imposed on others? And wouldn't that lead to a new kind of religion, one Nietzsche himself would reject? This ambiguity has sparked much debate, and it's no coincidence that many religious thinkers see Nietzsche as a direct adversary. Misinterpretations of his philosophy don't always stem from ignorance. They often come from a genuine disagreement with his views, although his position is far more nuanced and complex than it's usually credited for. It's fair to say that he was largely opposed to religion. This helps explain the criticism from those who see religion as essential for social cohesion and human well-being. Interestingly, Nietzsche was also unforgiving toward modern non-religious value systems. He criticized humanism with a vehemence that at times exceeded even his attacks on religion. For him, humanism turned egalitarianism, an idea he deeply distrusted, into an unquestionable moral absolute. From his perspective, that made it just as problematic as the religious systems he denounced. From this point, we can explore how Nietzsche extended this inquiry into the psychological realm, diving into the role of power as the main driver of human motivation. When we think of Nietzsche, one of his most famous and controversial ideas that comes to mind is the will to power. This concept is as complex as it is provocative, perhaps because Nietzsche himself never offered a single, definitive definition of it. In certain passages, Nietzsche describes the will to power simply as a desire to feel dominant. At other times, he presents it as a form of self-mastery, and in his more advanced writings, the idea is elevated to a metaphysical principle encompassing all of existence. But above all, the will to power was the lens through which Nietzsche examined human behavior. For him, understanding our actions, motivations, and even failures required understanding how we seek and exert power. However, like any provocative idea, this one also sparked intense debates and numerous misinterpretations. That's why I want to guide you through this concept in a clear and logical way, without sacrificing depth. Don't worry, by the end it will all make sense. At its core, Nietzsche argued that power is not just something we desire. It is what we long for above all else, more than pleasure or anything else. From his perspective, the pursuit of pleasure is like chasing illusions, a fleeting satisfaction that never truly fulfills us. Power, on the other hand, once attained, offers something deeper, a form of fulfillment that transcends hedonism. He even suggested that happiness is not a goal in itself, but rather a byproduct of the pursuit of power. If we think about it, this logic isn't too far from other systems of thought. For example, the Christian worldview holds that true fulfillment comes from connecting with God. Just as Nietzsche saw pleasure as a shallow distraction from something greater, Christianity also views worldly pleasure as a secondary temptation compared to divine purpose. In both cases, what initially seems satisfying is only a shadow of something more genuine. However, not everyone interprets the will to power from this reflective perspective. Some see it as a justification for a world where everything is a struggle for dominance. According to this reading, life is a constant competition in which human relationships are nothing more than disguised battles for control. Friendship, altruism, and sacrifice are fragile illusions hiding an ongoing fight for superiority. To support this critique, it's true that Nietzsche often praised historical figures like Napoleon, highlighting their ability to impose their will on others. He contrasted these great individuals with those who, unable to exert power, live immersed in resentment and self-pity. In this contrast, it's evident that Nietzsche had little tolerance for those he saw as incapable of forging their own destiny. But is the will to power really just that? Or does it offer a deeper insight into who we are and what drives us? Nietzsche doesn't give us simple answers, but that's precisely what makes his philosophy continue to fascinate and challenge us. Often, our interpretation of Nietzsche and his concept of power is distorted or overly simplistic, leaving out crucial elements of his original message. It's easy to fall into the trap of understanding the will to power solely as domination or brute force. However, when we delve into Nietzsche's writings, especially Beyond Good and Evil, and on the genealogy of morality, we discover that he offers a much more complex and captivating view of the concept of power. An interesting point is how he praises certain historical personalities, the so-called great men. Some examples may seem obvious, like Julius Caesar or Napoleon, leaders known for their impact and forceful actions. But Nietzsche also highlights figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, who were far from violence or conquest, masters of creativity, art, and thought. He even admires thinkers like Plato, Heraclitus, and ascetics, recognizing in them an inner strength that transcends mere domination or worldly power. If power were limited to external dominance, such praise would make no sense. So what did Nietzsche really mean by power? After years of studying and reflecting on his work, I've come to an interpretation that feels both deep and enriching. Nietzsche seems to use the idea of power on two main levels. The first is external power, that which manifests in the tangible world, shaping the reality around us, building, conquering, or transforming. But the second dimension is the one that fascinates me most, the power of self-overcoming. For Nietzsche, overcoming oneself is something greater and deeper than mere self-discipline. It's not just about controlling impulses or following external rules. It's about shaping one's life around values we create ourselves. This requires a process of sublimation where our basic impulses, like desire, anger, or even cruelty, are not suppressed but transformed into energy for something higher, such as creativity or thought. Here we find one of the central pillars of Nietzschean thought, the creation of values. Nietzsche criticized systems like Christianity or Stoicism for trying to repress our natural instincts, but he wasn't proposing we surrender to them blindly. On the contrary, he believed those instincts should be channeled, disciplined, and harnessed as a source of power for something greater. To him, life is not about fleeing pain or chasing pleasure without limits, but about embracing everything it presents to us, the good, the light, and the heavy. This idea is expressed in a beautiful concept, amor fati, or love of fate. According to Nietzsche, this means celebrating life as it is, with all its imperfections, contradictions, and challenges. It's not just about tolerating difficult moments, but learning to value them as much as the joyful ones. It's an invitation to live fully without rejecting any part of existence. For Nietzsche, reaching true personal power is the result of a long path of internal self-overcoming. It's like harmonizing the opposing forces within our will until they form a coherent whole. Once that strength of character is achieved, even the most intense suffering can be transformed into something valuable and meaningful. That's why expressions like, "What doesn't destroy you makes you stronger," and "He who has a why can endure almost any how," held deep meaning for Nietzsche. That inner strength was also the source of a creativity he intensely admired in figures like Goethe. Now, how does this connect to Nietzsche's admiration for Napoleon? According to Walter Kaufmann, Nietzsche understood power in multiple layers. At the bottom of the pyramid were those who lacked both internal and external power, toward whom he felt a certain contempt. Next were figures with great external power, like Napoleon, who earned his respect, though not without some reservations. But what Nietzsche valued above all was inner power and the ability to overcome oneself, traits he believed defined the true Übermensch, Superman. From this perspective, Nietzsche's concept of power is not a constant struggle to dominate others, as in an external battle, but rather an internal fight that each person must face within themselves. The goal is to overcome one's own limitations and ultimately arrive at a deep, unconditional love for life. Still, it's important to note that Nietzsche did not despise external power, such as authority or social status. He simply saw it as secondary to self-overcoming. With this in mind, we must avoid two extreme interpretations of Nietzsche. On one side are those who view him as a megalomaniac obsessed with domination and conquest. On the other, those who idolize him as a thinker focused exclusively on inner strength. Both distort the essence of his philosophy. Understanding Nietzsche means embracing the nuance, his simultaneous respect for both external power and the strength to surpass oneself from within. Finally, we cannot ignore one of the most controversial associations linked to Nietzsche, the appropriation of his ideas by fascism. Fortunately, this connection has been increasingly discredited, but it serves as a reminder of the importance of reading his work with care and avoiding simplifications that erase its complexity and contradictions. Nietzsche was a thinker who challenged the established norms, and grasping his philosophy requires facing those challenges head-on, without fear. On a personal level, Nietzsche did not choose his family, and if he had, he might have chosen a different one. His most problematic relationship was with his sister, Elizabeth, who constantly seemed to provoke him. Her marriage to a fervent anti-Semite only deepened the rift between them. Elizabeth's ties to extremist ideologies were something Nietzsche vehemently rejected. But what happened after his death was even worse. Elizabeth became an ardent supporter of the Nazi regime, twisted her brother's philosophy to justify fascist views, and even managed to win Hitler's admiration. She didn't just manipulate Nietzsche's public image, she also directly altered his writings. As the editor of his posthumous works, she had wide freedom to modify content, and we'll never know for certain to what extent those interventions were deliberate. A very telling case was her deliberate decision to delay the publication of Ecce Homo, a work in which Nietzsche openly criticized nationalism, particularly German nationalism. This manipulation deeply affected the proper interpretation of his thought, to the point where many ended up believing that Nietzsche himself supported fascism. However, this mistaken association wasn't due solely to his sister Elizabeth's actions. Some expressions used by Nietzsche, taken out of their original context, also made misunderstanding easier. A clear example is the phrase blonde beast, which he used to describe what he called noble morality. Out of context, this expression can be interpreted as racial glorification, though in reality it is something quite different. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche compares noble warriors to lions. When he spoke of the blonde beast, he referred to figures like Japanese or Arab warriors, ruling out any simplistic, race-based reading. This image is closely tied to the symbol of the lion. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the lion symbolizes a stage in the transformation process toward the Übermensch, or Overman, representing the break from old moral systems. The blonde beast for Nietzsche was a symbol of power and freedom, not of racial hierarchy. Furthermore, it's essential to understand that Nietzsche didn't understand race as we do today. When he used that term, he was usually referring more to cultural heritage than to biological traits. Though he made observations about differences between peoples, like Germans and French, these never implied ideas of racial superiority or inferiority. He simply had no interest in the racial theories dominant in his time, and even less in those that came later. Ultimately, Nietzsche's philosophy is far more complex and profound than the superficial interpretations that try to force it into fascist narratives. Sadly, his sister's manipulations left a shadow that still makes it difficult to uncover his true thinking. Nietzsche held deep intellectual respect for the traditions and cultures of India, an influence he received directly from Schopenhauer. This shows that he was far from being a racial elitist, as some might assume. His elitism seemed to be more oriented toward individuality. He believed that certain people stood out for their achievements and personal development, not because of their race or ethnicity. It's true that he occasionally mentioned that biological factors might play a role in that distinction, but never in a way that limited greatness to a specific race. Nietzsche insisted that exceptional individuals could arise from any human group. The problem is that, in today's context, the word elitism often carries biological or racial connotations that don't align with Nietzschean thought. In fact, some passages in his work clearly contradict that connection between merit and biology. For example, in one note, Nietzsche refers to differences of class, race, education, and culture as absurd accidents. He considers them irrelevant, emphasizing instead that true value lies in what he calls the ascending path, the ability to fully embrace life and overcome the slave morality, shaped by resentment toward one's own existence. When Nietzsche speaks of terms like lineage or blood, he is most likely referring symbolically to the legacy of ideas, values, and behaviors that shape the individual, not to genetic or racial inheritance. He also used words like barbarian to represent broader philosophical concepts, such as the force of human passions and their influence on the spirit. This kind of metaphorical language is often misunderstood, especially when people try to fit it into modern concepts of race and biology. It's true that his elitism may feel uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, especially if one takes his references to blood and lineage literally. In that sense, one could argue there are problematic elements in his thinking. However, if those images are understood as metaphors, then his philosophy stands completely apart from any form of racism or eugenics. In short, Nietzsche was an extremely complex thinker. He didn't promote racial hierarchies, but neither did he advocate for modern notions of equality. His focus was on the individual and their capacity to overcome limitations, a perspective that, while controversial, invites deep reflection on human potential and the dangers of superficial judgments. Similarly, Nietzsche was highly critical of any form of idolatry, whether toward a race or a nation. For him, this kind of blind loyalty was not far removed from the herd mentality he so harshly criticized in organized religion. His stance was so firm that he even broke ties with his own sister and with Richard Wagner due to the anti-Semitism they both expressed. Nietzsche was far from supporting the idea of a superior race or any kind of national supremacy. In Ecce Homo, he doesn't hold back in his criticism of German culture, describing it as useless in many aspects. However, despite this direct criticism, it's undeniable that some of his ideas had points of contact with values that were later associated with 20th century fascism. One of those points is his rejection of egalitarianism, which contrasted with an elitist view of society. Another is his exaltation of power. But it's crucial to remember that, as we've already seen, Nietzsche's concept of power is far deeper and more complex than the simplified interpretation adopted by the fascists. For that reason, this second point is at least debatable. It's important to be clear. Criticism of Nietzsche doesn't come out of nowhere. His thinking is intricate and, as with any great philosopher, it left room for varied interpretations and even manipulations. A clear example is his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, who distorted his ideas to align them with ideologies he never would have supported. Even so, it would also be a mistake to try to fit Nietzsche into humanist, egalitarian, or any other modern label. He was a thinker who always escaped easy categorization, and perhaps the greatest injustice we could commit would be to reduce him to something he never was. One aspect on which many experts on Nietzsche's work agree is his absolute originality. Trying to reduce that uniqueness to simple concepts often results in caricatured distortions of his philosophy. To close, it's worth reflecting on how Nietzsche himself wanted to be remembered. In Ecce Homo, through the voice of Zarathustra, he expresses, "No fanatic is speaking to you here. This is not a sermon. No faith is required. I now follow my own path, and I want you to follow yours in solitude. He who remains a disciple pays poorly. Why not tear off my laurel crown? I command you to forgive me and to find yourselves, and only when you all have denied me will I return to you." What Nietzsche ultimately teaches us is the freedom to think for ourselves, even if that means rejecting him in order to find our own path. That reflection has always felt deeply meaningful to me. In essence, Nietzsche did not seek to be idolized, nor for his ideas to be taken as immutable truths. On the contrary, he valued criticism, discussion, and disagreement. His goal was something greater: to inspire truly free thinkers, people who would not cling to his literal words, but who would embrace the spirit of his intellectual courage and his fearless questioning of everything. Nietzsche didn't see himself as a master to be followed without question, but as a spark, a starting point for future minds, each one carving their own path. It's intriguing to think that perhaps his entire project, as suggested by the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil, was merely a beginning, a preparation for a future philosophy, alive, bold, and ever-evolving. If you've made it this far, I want you to remember this. This isn't just about Nietzsche or abstract philosophy. It's about you, about your courage to question, to look within and ask yourself what truly belongs to you, what you've inherited, and what you want to build. That's something special. Many abandon the path, but you've stayed until the end. That says a lot about you. Nietzsche believed in the strength of those who don't settle for simple answers, those who face the uncomfortable void to create something unique. And you, by being here until the end, show that you have a restless spirit, one that doesn't stay still. And that, my friend, is what drives the world forward. So thank you for sharing this time with me. Every person who decides to go deeper, to debate and reflect, not only keeps new philosophy alive, they make it stronger. And if this content has impacted you in some way, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, because it's through those exchanges that ideas grow into something greater. Before we say goodbye, I encourage you not to leave these reflections here. Carry them with you into your life, your conversations, and your dreams. If you want to join me on this journey, subscribe to the channel. There's still so much to discover, and I'd love for us to explore it together. In the end, as Nietzsche wisely said, it's in the encounter that something new is born. Keep chasing what gives life meaning, not what's easy, but what's authentic. This video is just the beginning of a much deeper conversation. I invite you to continue it with me through the videos appearing on screen. Each one dives deeper into and expands on the ideas we explored today and could change the way you see things. I'll be waiting for you there. Pick one and let's move forward together.